Hello, I'm Jyri Raitasalo, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
I love this. This is one of the best things about the modern world, Jyri, is you're in Finland. I'm here in Orange County, California. I'm in a tent in my backyard, and we can talk across the ocean, continents, and everything else about current events and take your expertise, my expertise. And although we're stacked in the same column of expertise, what we know individually is so different because of our points of view, our strategic and tactical things that we've had to do because we're from different places. And now we get to talk about it. One of my favorite things that you said to me was there are many Europes. And it blew my mind because it's so true. You have Baltic Europe, Balkan Europe, UK Europe. I mean, it's just there are so many different interests. And now we have this Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And as much as we want this to be state on state, oh boy, it's been a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, when we were talking last time, I think it was something like 4 years ago or something like that. And the comment about many Europes, I think today Europe is quite united. So I think that, we have come from the situation of many Europes into a more united, maybe a single Europe, at least for some time, because of what we are seeing going on over Ukraine.
Russia's part of Europe. So how do you have a united Europe when you have this problematic Russia?
Well, I think that what I'm referring to is the western part of Europe.
Okay.
Dealing with this problem with Russia, I think that the tensions have been really high ever since 2014. So in this regard, it's not a totally new game, but of course this war is something that has just changed everything. But the relationship between Russia and the rest of Europe, the western part of Europe, they have been sour for many years. It didn't even start in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion in the Donbas area, but it was already before that for several years, including the war between Georgia and Russia in 2008.
I guess we have to just start off with what is the Finn perspective of this conflict? I mean, and not just yours, but like in general, what are some of the thoughts that you folks in your country have about this god-awful war?
Well, I think there are many points to bring up here. Of course, first is surprise. I don't think that too many people in Finland or practically anywhere in Europe were expecting this. For me, as a kind of a docent of strategy and security policy, I don't see this making strategic sense. So in that way, it was a surprise. It was, of course, a great disappointment for everybody in Finland and Europe as well. And I think that one more point is that, I think that people in Finland are realizing that, all those investments in our own defense during the post-Cold War era, when throughout the several decades, there were practically no military threats in Europe. I think people appreciate that now. So there was kind of there's a sense of relief in a way that we have been doing right things with our defense in order to prevent anything bad happening against us.
It's a surprise that Russia does this. At some point, you guys, like we did, saw it coming. You're like, hey, the Olympics are happening, and we're probably going to have a fight immediately after that. When did it start to set in that, hey, this is actually going to happen? And then what were your expectations going in? Because now we've seen most of the fight. It's not over yet. It can still turn. It can still get worse. But we've seen most of it. So when did you start to realize, hey, this is actually going to happen? And then what did you immediately think was going to be the outcome?
Well, I think that when listening to people who are looking at capabilities and force posture, they were saying at the latter part of maybe November last year, in December, that this really looks like it's going to be a war. It looks like the posture of the Russian forces and the number of the battalion tactical groups and other supporting formations is going to be so big, and the capabilities are going to be aligned in a way that it makes a big invasion possible. So I think that was a kind of if you look at the kind of the military technical things. But of course, as I was mentioning already, that when you put the political layer on that, what kind of political objectives are available with that force? So that is why I had some problems, and I think many people had problems of realizing that actually it's going to be a big war coming, because it's really hard to find the logic of anything positive coming out of this for Russia in a very long time. I can see so many negative things coming out of this. Of course, for Ukraine the most, but for Russia as well. So that is the part that is actually puzzling me. So you can't, infer intentions from capabilities, and I think that was the problem.
And with this conflict being, I mean, just in this day and age, it seems impossible that Russia would invade Ukraine. Okay, Crimea, some skirmishes and some small land grabs, that kind of thing. But this full-scale invasion and attempt to, decapitate the Ukrainian government, this just seems like something from another time. Who's advising Putin and saying, yes, this is a good course of action? And is that guy going to be alive in a couple of weeks?
Well, I don't know about that, but I think you're totally right that there must have been an expectation of a very short military operation with not too many casualties and not too many kind of collateral damage as either. But I think that this is a kind of a textbook example of what happens when you start a military operation or war that we have seen, throughout the decades, whether it's Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan, with the Soviet Union or with the Western states, and now in Ukraine for Russia, that you are overestimating your own capabilities and abilities to get something done with your military forces, and you are underestimating the problems facing you. So I think this is really typical. So for me, kind of one of the first lessons identified, and which is kind of strengthening my previous ideas, is that it's really, really, really hard to get some political goals and achieve political goals with the use of large-scale violence and war. And I think that we have seen this throughout the decades in the post-Cold War era, and this kind of accentuates that fact.
When the other states look around, Finland included, and you think, okay, can we reliably, at least in Europe, can we use force on a large scale like this, or is the entire world? I mean, there's people still to this moment worried about nuclear, biological, chemical, type weapons, radiation weapons. Are we having to look now that we've seen Russia utterly fail, and if they can't do it with their willingness to fight, is that era of war over, at least in Europe?
Well, I think that the most of Europe has been pacified for the last 30, 40 years, and even before that. So I don't think that in Europe there has been this. People haven't been thinking about the use of war as a kind of viable instrument in statecraft for decades. And now I'm, of course, talking about the countries that are part of, for example, European Union and NATO. But I think that what is happening now is going to change that. It does mean that many countries in Europe are going to put more resources and more effort into defense. So I think there has been a lot of discussion about how America has been sponsoring European security during the last 30 plus years, and even during the Cold War. But I do think that many European states are now going to put more resources. They are going to take defense seriously, and they are also taking big war seriously. Because as you know, there's European and Western way of war has been expeditionary operations out of area, somewhere out there. These, so-called forever wars that every state is sending a quite small contribution, but they last a long time. And those are totally different kind of military operations that we are seeing here in Ukraine, and this is going to have serious implications and for European militaries and European states.
NATO is 70 years old. Our last president here, Donald Trump, was inclined to believe that the NATO states needed to reach their level of commitment militarily, financially, and was sort of holding them accountable. And I think his intention was to separate from NATO. Like, it easily could have been, if there was a second term, he might have pulled the U.S. out and said, hey, we're done. You guys aren't doing your part. But now that we've seen this fight, do you think the other NATO countries are going to, and you kind of answered this already, but do you think that they will increase their level of participation and compliance with the community in terms of the finances and upping the ante to hold at bay a Russia or whoever else is a threat to the NATO alliance?
Well, I think this applies to NATO countries and non-NATO countries in Europe.
Okay.
I think that every country here is learning lessons that if you don't have the capabilities the consequences can be so serious, and they have so long-term consequences that it's much smarter to spend an extra billion or 2 billion or 10 billion beforehand than to repair the damages afterwards. That is going to be extremely expensive, and of course the humanitarian price is even higher. So I do think that throughout Europe we are going to see the increase in defense spending. We are going to see bigger militaries. We are going to see better capabilities and more of those. I'm sure for that.
So this is a hard question. I'm not sure. There are probably several answers, but so I can't wait to ask. But is the era of tanks over, or did the Russians just do a poor job of the logistics and provisioning their tanks?
Well, I don't think that the era of the tank is over, but I do think that you need to have a balanced force, and I do think that you have to, all the time when you're developing the force, you need to you need to rely also and have a good feel about the emerging technologies and the possibilities to counter those technologies and capabilities that are out there already. You can only renew maybe 2 or 3% of your total military posture or force during 1 year. So the kind of changes in the field of military are rather slow. And I don't think that, for example, what we have seen in Ukraine, what we have seen before, for example, in many African contingencies, the use of drones, or in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2020. So I do think that we have seen the use of drones against many targets, and they have been rather successful. And I do think, for example, we need to integrate those as well into all of the militaries, and everybody is doing it now. But they are not going to be the silver bullet. There are going to be systems that are going to counter their effectiveness, of course, just like there are systems that are countering the effectiveness of tanks. So you can't rely on 1 or 2 tricks to get better. You need to have a really balanced force, and more than that, you need to have a really balanced and a well-trained personnel to use those. And you mentioned logistics. Of course, you have to have that in order as well. So it's a really tricky question, because there are so many aspects to being a credible military actor, and if you fail in one, the results can be devastating during wartime.
Without making this conflict over, because I want to get back into the actual current conflict now, but what have we seen with Russian capabilities? I mean, and I'm not asking you to ask as a member of the Finnish military, just in general, your opinion on what kind of a fighting force have we seen from these guys?
Well, I think that one quick or first impression, another lesson identified is that the kind of the morale of the fighting force is really important, and I would say also the morale of the society, the willingness to fight, is really important. If I compare Ukraine and Russia in this regard, I would say that Ukraine is really doing a remarkable job. People are willing to fight for their country, even if they might not have the best of equipment, but everybody wants to participate in the defense and securing their own state. And I don't see that so much in the case of Russian forces, or at least the kind of the publicly available news parts that I have seen emphasize that there is low morale. Soldiers are not told exactly what they are doing, why are they fighting. So I do think that that is one part of the explanation about what are the results. Of course, and then there are many other things. The quality of the equipment, the quality of the logistics, how is intelligence going on, and so on.
This was supposed to work. It was supposed to be a fast fight. We were going to come in. They were going to surround Kiev, and almost instantly there were problems. What was the Achilles heel to this early first month of the attack for Russia?
Well, I think it was the preparedness of the Ukrainian society. It was the preparedness of the Ukrainian military to be able to prevent this decapitation attack. And once that was done, then it seems from these first impressions that it seems that the Russian military wasn't well prepared enough to go on a bigger operation. And as we have seen, spreading the forces thin on a very broad, several areas of operation at the same time, without too much logistical preparation, has been really difficult for them.
It's one thing to sit in a tank and be relatively impervious to most things thrown at you and drive to Kiev. It's another thing to have a farmer behind you with, the ability and the desire to attack you with whatever they can throw at you. I mean, look, an RKG-3 is a tank killing grenade. Not super effective, but if you're willing to go after a tank, you can kill a tank as a farmer. I think war in a lot of ways is democratized. You can create a drone force. You can, with off-the-shelf software, you can be a sniper effective out to a mile plus, like over, I'd say 2 kilometers, right? With the technology we have. So you can drive in front of a bunch of people and think that you're surrounding Kiev, but really find yourself surrounded by this force that doesn't oblige your military plan.
Yeah, when you're having mechanized forces moving on a territory of another country, you immediately start losing your support capabilities, and that is of course a problem for the invader. And it's a totally opposite thing for the defender, who have been building their defenses for years, who know the terrain, who know everything about the best places to do ambushes and so on. So I think that once this decapitation attack didn't work out as it was planned, I suppose, the problems started to accumulate, and it seems that the Russian military wasn't prepared well enough for this. And of course, we don't know exactly the reasons why this happened, but there has been a lot of talk about lack of enough communication in advance between the political leadership and the military.
And if you're a colonel in the Russian army and you're seeing things right now a month in and you're further from your goal than you thought you would be 3+ weeks later, actually 4 weeks later, how do you advise your commander above? I mean, what do you do when you're in this fight? At some point, there has to, you sue for peace, but they're not going to win that suit. And so, I don't know. I mean, you can't keep pushing because that's not working. You could redouble. I don't know. What do the Russians do right now, Jyri?
Well, what we are seeing, based on the reports, and not just watch public media, we have been seeing that quite many of lines of attack have stopped. They are regrouping. They are resupplying. They are taking care of the wounded and the killed, and so on and so on. So there has been a kind of a culmination of the main offensive efforts. And of course, as we have heard from the Russian state leadership, that now they are in a way moving to an, as they call it, the phase 2 of the operation, focusing on the eastern parts, which according to many is because the war efforts haven't been achieved on the main axis towards Kiev. So now they're moving on the eastern part of Ukraine. But I would say that we still haven't seen the whole story here. And the war could go on for months or for more than a year. So we don't know what's going to happen. There are some positive signs in a way that there are discussions, and there have been discussions between Russian and Ukrainian authorities, but we don't know how long this will take, how much more destruction are we going to see, and how much more suffering for the people living in Ukraine.
We always have to ask this question because it's worthy asking, and people are terrified of it. What are your thoughts on Russia, as they're losing, going and doing something nuclear? Look, the next person killed by Russian radiation in another country won't be the first, right? So they're not afraid to use this stuff in a very tactical manner. Do you think we'll see something on the chemical, nuclear, radioactive, biological forefront?
Well, I don't know, but I think that the threshold for that is really high. And I do think that if we are now seeing a united West and a united Europe in sanctioning Russia, I think that going nuclear or going for weapons of mass destruction would be a totally new ball game, and it would have serious strategic level consequences for Russia for decades. So I think that would be really, even if it ended up in stopping the war and Russia could dictate the end result of the war, that would be really a Pyrrhic victory, and it would make Russians suffer for a really long time. So I don't believe that it makes any kind of a strategic sense, and I do not believe it makes any humanitarian sense or moral sense. So I do think that the threshold is going to be really high. It would be a sign of desperation.
And the Russian military has already taken a pretty big hit. Granted, they've got more resources, but you can only, and just for the audience, a battalion has about 1,000 people. A brigade has 5,000 or so people, and these are rough numbers depending on the country and everything else. But they've lost a division's worth of people and a lot of materiel. I mean, it's, unless your economy is built on building tanks and that kind of thing, which theirs hasn't been yet, that military has been decimated several times over in terms of what's available. Now, they must have more things in reserve. They're not out of tanks, but at some point, there's not a whole lot left to shoot back with, and like you said, the morale starts to plummet.
Yeah, the Russian way of war has been for a long time. It has been emphasizing the use of artillery and indirect fires, and that is kind of in a way also the aspect that when this mode kicks in, and we have seen that already in many suburban areas and in many cities also in Ukraine, it's really taking its toll on the civilians and the infrastructure. So if Russia is losing those battalion tactical groups, or it cannot use those so effectively, of course the unfortunate alternative is to use massed fires indiscriminately on targets that seems to be civilian in many cases, and that means really adding up to the suffering in Ukraine, and that's a really sorry way for this to move forward.
So this goes back to the the chemical biological stuff. That is a lower level step to go to if you decide just to absolutely destroy Kiev and whatever's inside of it with fires. And by the way, for the audience, fires are not fire. It's like let's just say artillery. A lot of artillery dropped into an area to smash it. Right. But is that also got the same level of retribution internationally if they decide to level Kiev?
Well, I think that would of course do it, but unfortunately, we have seen that already in smaller cities. And if you look at the images coming from Mariupol or Kharkiv or other places, it reminds me a lot of what we have seen for example, in Syria, where whole cities have been leveled and destroyed with these artillery bombardments. But I do think that just starting to destroy Kiev block by block would be something that would never be forgotten, and I don't think that this war is ever going to be forgotten, and it will take a really long time, even what has happened so far, for Russia to get back from the cold when this is over.
How do Finns see Russians in general, and how do Finns see Russians militarily?
Well, I think that the way to look at Russian people is that they are not making decisions on this war. So and we have a lot of Russians and Russian speakers here in Finland. So this is not their war in a way. It's the political leadership that is doing this. How we are seeing Russian military, it's a big one, as we have noted for several decades. And even when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was inheriting the military might of the Soviet Union, it started to go down, but still it has been huge. But of course, as we have seen in Ukraine, they have many problems. And I think that the corruption is one big problem. So they have been pouring quite a lot of money into transforming their military for more than a decade to make it a modern one. But I think that quite a lot has been lost in the process, quite a lot of the money, which means they have not been able to build those capabilities that many thought that they would have. So I do think that this has been also eye-opening for many Western intelligence analysts and analysts, academic analysts as well, the performance, how they have done so far. And I do think that they have performed poorly compared to the expectations that people had before the war started.
And then Brad asked a good question here. Let me put this question up. Do we want, as an international community, this fight to go on a little longer? We'll just keep sending, provisions over to Ukraine, let them fight, and continue to weaken the overall Russian position. Is this advantageous at the multinational strategic level to have this fight continue? I mean, it's low level, right? Like we don't have a massive fight like a World War II fight. It's a state-on-state fight. Do we want this to continue strategically?
I don't think we want it to continue. I do think that if you look at the kind of level of humanitarian suffering in Ukraine, I think it's so inhumane that I don't think that this is something that anybody, at least in the western part of Europe or in Europe or in the Western world, thinks.
Yeah, it's pretty horrible, and it's an expensive problem. I mean, this is a multi-trillion-dollar problem already because you have all this humanitarian crisis, and oh my gosh, there's just so many things that cost a lot of money and pain and misery.
And even if it stopped today, it will take it will take a decade and more to get everything not back to normal, but back to something that is human standard.
And also, we can't forget that Russia is taking a pretty big hit too. I'm not trying to, there's not much sympathy for Russia right now, but the Russian people are taking a pretty enormous hit. They're losing their sons, militarily. They're going to buy new stuff, and that means that there's going to be a cost on the other side as they try to get back to normal. How do we avoid a situation like we had in the early 20th century when Germany is beaten in World War I and gets a nasty deal in the end, and that ultimately helps to reignite World War because the agreement wasn't tenable? How do we avoid that?
Well, that's a good question, but I do think that I think we have learned some lessons from the past, maybe from the First World War and Second World War, and also from the end of the Cold War. But I do think that there's going to be a price for starting a war like this. So I think that's kind of going to be a balancing act. But quite a lot of depends on how this ends. What is the kind of process that brings all this to an end, and what happens next? So it's not just how do we, or how do Western states, or how do NATO or whoever, how do they avoid the mistake? You need two to tango. So Russia has to be part of that. Ukraine has to be part of that, and of course the rest of Europe is going to be part of that with the United States. So I don't have an answer. How do we avoid that? But I do think that everybody, all of those sides, really understand that if we are going to kind of prepare for the next war in this setting, it's going to be disadvantageous for everybody.
American interest aside, so I'm not asking from our point of view. Can Putin run Russia anymore? Forget about punitively. Like when he shows up to other world leaders, and they have tete-a-tetes and everything, can he reliably do anything anymore, or is his era closed with this war? Has he used up all of his international political capital?
Well, at least he has used the capital within the West with the Western states. That's for sure. But I think that there are still many states that are, if not supporting, are not shouting out loud that they are opposing the war either. So if you look at the biggest ones, I think that China has been supporting Russia, maybe not supporting the war effort, but supporting it as a state against the West. But also India has been kind of if not supporting, but I think that doing business. So I do think that it's not over, but it's going to be much more difficult for Russia's state leadership to effectively manage international relations.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be hard to get a dinner with England if you're Putin. I mean, that guy's probably not high on their friends list. There's another good comment here. Russia, a friend of mine whose father was a Poland top pilot under the USSR's occupation stated, other nations can only feel safe from Russia when Russia is preoccupied attacking other nations. Is that true for Finland?
Well, I do think that we have been feeling safe for 30 years during the post-Cold War era, and I think that now that we are seeing that war is back here, many people in Finland and many people in Europe have to kind of relearn the old lessons that you have to do, and you have to in a way sacrifice even during the good times, but also especially during the bad times, in order not to be drawn out in a war. So I do think that this kind of manifests the need to do a little bit more to keep us safe.
Kaliningrad's not that far from Helsinki. What is it? I don't know, in kilometers. It's about 500 miles. It's just not that far. It's a 6-hour drive if you could drive straight across. Does it bother you guys that Kaliningrad is there?
Well, that Kaliningrad is quite far away. We have 1,300 kilometers of land border with Russia. So Kaliningrad is within the Baltic Sea region. It's closer to the Baltic states and Poland and Sweden and so on. But of course, we have a common border with Russia, and we have had that for the entire time that we have been independent for more than 100 years. And for the most part of that, the border has been really secure and it has been safe. But of course, that is one aspect of our geostrategic positioning, that we have this border with Russia.
Yeah, you guys feel pretty confident in that, and that. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are a lot closer together. What about Belarus and their role in all of this as sort of I guess you would have to call them an ally of Russia. How do they come out of this whole thing?
Well, it looks pretty bad for them today. I do think that what has happened inside of Belarus with the elections, people revolting or wanting to have their voices heard against an autocrat, Lukashenko, has led to a situation now that Belarus is quite well under the control of Russia's state leadership. So it's in a way a sorry state for Belarus now.
Is this something that we work on internationally, is to try to realign Belarus and so that they're less dependent upon Russian support and maybe try to, I don't know, look, we're so bad at these things, but what do we do about Belarus to make them less of a problem? Because there's got to be a price to pay for them as well.
Yeah, but I do think that they are now in a position where they are a really junior partner in the union state with Russia, and what happened with the mass protests and all the kind of the use of force against the society, civilian society by Lukashenko in the preceding months and years now, I do think that there's nothing that the West can do. Of course, using the sanction tool more against Belarus as the West has done is one of the tools available. But I think that it looks rather meek now. And I don't see a quick win or quick way out to get Belarus back on its feet. But most likely it will need a leadership change and some kind of a national process. But we don't see that happening when we're looking at the situation in Belarus today.
When we go to rebuild Ukraine, do we have a real belief internationally that there won't be a ton of corruption and people getting rich and Ukraine being this broken state for a long time? Like, I mean, that's certainly a possible outcome with this whole thing.
Well, Ukraine has had a big corruption problem for a long time, and Russia has had it as well. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But still, with this corruption problem, I think they have been able to put a really good fight. And they have been, really been able to defend the country with the resources that they have had left, even despite the corruption. But I think that the Ukrainian society is getting stronger as a society. Kind of the spirit is growing now, because when you have an external threat, and this as we have seen, it's war that is being waged there. So this could have a long-term effects when the war is over.
One of the things we've seen is some of the U.S. culture, this cancel culture, has bled into how we are dealing with Russian things. People don't want to call it. There's a cocktail out here called the Moscow Mule. We don't want to call it. We call it the Kiev Mule now, or the Kiev Mule. A Formula One driver and his father were kicked out of Formula One. Formula One took away the Russian race. There was a Russian opera singer who sings in New York City who was fired from her job. I mean, these things have nothing to do with this conflict. And it at some point you can't just cancel Russia. Russia's going to exist. And there was a movement. Sean Penn, of all people, thought Zelensky should appear at the Oscars. Like he's not already busy doing something. This stuff to me seems just patently ridiculous and in no way helpful, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, how do you guys view America when we push these narratives of canceling things that are Russian? No longer, we can't have Russian dressing on our salad anymore. These things seem ridiculous, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, I don't know if you're wrong or not, but what I can say, that I think that it just reflects to me that there are many people who want to do something and who want to have a say about how they feel about many things, and I do think that's one way to express that. I think you had the freedom fries instead of French fries 2 decades ago. So I think that's the same thing.
We weren't even mad at the French. We just picked it. I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As an academic, what have you learned from this entire conflict? I mean, we all look. One of the things I've been asking a lot of you smart folks who come on. So many of us have spent our careers studying Russia and what will Russia do? Russia, 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 over and over and over again. PhDs are written, and everybody's like, "This is what's going to happen because this is their baby. This is their thing that they want to have happen." And they see World War III starting or whatever it's going to be. As an academic, what have you seen and what were you surprised to see? How has your game changed since this whole thing started over a month ago?
Well, there are many things, coming from the tactical level up to the strategic level. And we have been talking about some of those first things that come to mind. But if I start on top at the strategic level, the first thing is that, big war is back. And I have been writing a little bit about on that topic for some time. But I do think that this is kind of an eye-opening moment for many people, especially in Europe. Even after, 2014, when people were making, rhetorical arguments about rebuilding defense in Europe, I don't think that too much happened on that field, but I do think that now it's going to happen. And when I look at what kind of political decisions have been made and what kind of pledges have been done and given, I do think that this is a different thing totally than what happened in 2014. The other maybe kind of strategic factor is that you need to be prepared, which means that you have to have your, in a way, security of supply or strategic stockpiles ready. You need to take care of all of that. Third part, maybe still in the strategic level, is that it's not only about military. There are many ways to influence other countries. So in the Finnish case, we used to have this total defense system during the Cold War, and we have been developing that. And I do think it's really important that we have the interagency cooperation to prepare against threats. We have to have enterprises and companies be part of that, and also the civilian sector as well. So it's a kind of a broad ball game, and we need to be more prepared than we have been. And maybe the last one on the strategic level, there will be still some others, but to give you also a possibility to say something, that you need to be able to spend money on security. So cheap defense will give you cheap results, and cheap security will give you cheap results. So I think that we in Europe we need to invest more into our security, and that's not military only. I think it's much broader aspect. Then if we move a little bit downwards towards operational and tactical things, we have talked about the importance of logistics, the importance of intelligence, and that the intelligence isn't politicized. The intelligence people and the kind of the state leadership need to have a common culture where experts and analysts can actually say what they are seeing, and that what they are producing and the products that they're delivering, they are not spinned for certain political goals, because that invites disaster. And I do think that we have seen some aspects of this process going on in the war on Ukraine, on Russia's part. And maybe if something on a tactical level, and even below that, the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, we have seen that innovative use of rather cheap weapon systems brings results, so that we have seen lack of communications being hindering military operations. Secure communications is really important. Emission control is important. We have seen the use of drones, and we have seen quite a lot of innovation and flexibility in using very normal everyday tools, from the cell phones to quadro choppers, whatever have you, in making the case for defense. So I do think that there's a whole lot of lessons to be learned, but I think quite a lot of those will emerge a little bit later on. We have only seen a month or so of this war.
Yeah, we actually kind of get through the rest of this war, right? Like, we'd like to see it get closed down.
Yeah, you're right.
With the ultimate collapse of the initial initiative that Russia had, NATO was sort of a wobbly old man a while ago, And now all of a sudden we've seen the power of NATO being able to unite. They haven't even used Title V, and there's talk of Sweden maybe joining NATO, maybe Ukraine joining NATO, maybe we're going to sweep Finland into NATO with us. But is NATO relevant? And then is Russia an exception? I mean, are we worried about an invasion like Italy massing tanks on the Swiss-Austrian border and taking over that, or taking over Monaco as a micro state? What other European state are we worried about? Is NATO still just the same old doddering old man that's like kind of effective, but do we really need it?
Well, I think NATO was in really big problem. So when the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union was gone. And of course, what they did, they went out of area. And that's what we have been seeing during the last 30 years. Afghanistan, of course, being the biggest part of that. But I do think that, Russia has given NATO a new lease on life. 2014, it started with the Crimea and the Eastern Ukraine part, and now this. So I do think that there's a clear sense of purpose. There's a clear logic for NATO member states and other European states. Why do they need military forces, and why do they need more military capability? So actually, what Russia has achieved with this attack on Ukraine, it has solidified European understanding of defense. So I do think that NATO is now doing better than it has been doing for a couple of decades, because I personally think that the operations, out of area operations, have not been that successful, and they have been they have. In many cases, more likely they have brought more security problems than they have been able to solve.
Yeah, and then how long does that hit that improvement of NATO's status? How long does that last? I mean, if Europe goes back to a relatively stable, I mean, look, the last big conflict was the degradation of the Yugoslavian state into the whole Balkan conflicts at all. I mean, that took a long time to sort out, and in some ways still being sorted out. I mean, if we go another 20 years before we have another European conflict of any kind of large scale, does NATO even survive that long? Do they have 20 years, or do they become irrelevant again in like 2 weeks once we get this over? Our attention spans, at least here in America, aren't that great.
Well, Pete, I'm really sorry to say that, I have run out of clarity in my crystal ball. So whether NATO is going to be there in 20 years, I really have no idea. But I do think that the lessons that at least European states, and I would say US as well, are picking up from what is happening now, is going to be that, there is the possibility of a long-term great power competition turning into a more nasty competition, and maybe even war on several occasions in the future. So I do think that we are going to see some long-term lessons to be learned that will have long-term consequences. And if the European states get their military act together and they start actually building more military capabilities, it's going to be a long-term thing. As you know, once you get good military capabilities, they are not going anywhere in the next 20 or 30 years. This is a long-term thing. So if you let it wither away, it will take a long time, 2 decades, to rebuild it. But once you got it, it will also take some time to lose it, if you are not losing it deliberately and dismantling it.
Right. How long is it going to take Russia to get back to their pre-fighting capability? I mean, okay, if they've lost a division worth of soldiers, to fatalities, they've lost twice that in significant injuries of people that can't serve anymore. You're talking about the better part of 50,000 service members that are no longer capable of doing their job at some level. How long does it take to repair that?
Well, I think, to answer that question, I think we need to see more. Where is this heading? How big is the kind of the attrition going to be is this going to be a longer-term thing? But I do think that, they have taken a hit. Of course, they have, massive reserves in a way, if you talk about equipment. But not of that is the first-rate equipment, so that it will take some time. And as we have seen, with these quite big investments in defense in military things during the last decade and more, not everything has turned out that okay. So I do think that, the corruption part of the society has meant that quite a lot of the money that was meant to be for getting better capabilities has gone somewhere else. And I think that has also hindered what the Russian military capability is today. And of course, kind of solving this problem for Russia in the future is going to be really important if they really want to rebuild quickly as much of the losses as they have suffered. But maybe I should remind that they have a big military still, and they have lost some part of that, but they still have quite a lot of fighting power left. So we haven't seen the end of this war, and we haven't seen the kind of the destruction of the Russian military. So we shouldn't overemphasize the losses, which are great or big, but still there is quite a lot of stuff in a way waiting to be used.
I don't want to access your crystal ball too much, but I do want to ask you this, because if this does drag out, the next time we pick a side and start doing airstrikes into that country, it won't be the first time in the last 30 years. I mean, Serbia, for whatever reason, we picked them to be the bad person internationally, and NATO, amongst others, America specifically. We flew missions straight on in. Could we see a counter-striking air-based, if Russia doesn't comply, do we see some of that airstrike capability from some country? I don't know which one. Do you think we'll see some of that going inland, or even a Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Well, I think that what everybody needs to expect is that the U.S., European states, Russia, and China will not fight each other. I think that it would be a really big disaster if we have nuclear states fighting each other, being on the opposite sides. So I do think that everybody realizes that. All of the state leaderships in these countries realize that, and I think that many people have said that out aloud during the recent weeks and months. So I do think that there are many processes or factors that are influencing the situation so that these big powers won't be fighting each other, and I hope they won't. It's going to be big, and it's going to be dramatic if they did.
I want to bring up this point here by, and I don't know how to, Renovatio, I guess is how he says his name. The Russians have millions, they have millions of troops. They can just push more in. I don't know that era exists anymore in Russia in modern times. I mean, Elon Musk just said, hey, let there be the internet, because I'm a billionaire and I have a space internet and anybody can access this thing and put information out. I don't know that the Russians would stand by a million. I mean, that first off, that would be bigger than the military they have. A million of their sons pulled out of the society and pushed into this conflict. I don't know that Putin's government could bear that. And if they're going to take 1 million of my kids, I'm going to get 5,000 of my friends and just go march on down and decapitate my own country. Do you think it's possible that we can see that old Russian style of just continuing to throw people and pick up the dead guy's rifle and use it, or has that day passed?
Well, I don't think we are going to see. I think talk about millions is not that accurate. But of course, I think what I turn this question into is how much can they mobilize more if they want? How much reserves do they have that are well trained, ready to serve, and they have the equipment available that they can be used? And of course, Russia has some of that.
Yeah.
The military, the actual active duty military, is something like 900,000 soldiers in total, all of the services and branches included, but they have used a massive part of, especially of the land forces for this operation, and of course recuperating whenever the war is over is going to take some time. Yes. But I don't think that the Russian state leadership and the military leadership is looking at this thing just pouring in badly trained people to get killed. I don't see that.
The Baltic states, they're really micro European states. No offense to the folks from the Baltics, you guys are awesome, but there's only about 6 million people there. That's the size of Chicago's, area, and that's although a big area, they can't stand up to that, right? And so they need a NATO or whatever it's going to be, the EU, to help them protect themselves. How does Finland see the Baltics? Are they your friends? Are they? I don't know. How do you guys see it? And then is that a reason enough for NATO to continue to exist? And do those Baltics need to do more?
Well, I think that the Baltic states realize their position, and they are part of NATO, and NATO is part of their defense, an important part of defense. And I do think that the Baltic states are doing quite a lot because of the history, being part of the Soviet Union, because of the situation, strategic situation where they find themselves in. So I do think that they are taking their defense seriously. But as you mentioned, of course, for very small states and small states, it's of course a struggle if you would need to fight or prevent war coming from a great power. So that is their dilemma, and NATO is one big part of their answer to that. But I would also say that it's also about national defense. They are doing their share and spending more than their share in doing defense in a way. And I think that looking at this, there are many European states that could follow their model.
When we look at all the people that are aligned against Russia, boy, I see NATO. I mean, sorry, not NATO. Poland as being just this primary alpha dog that wants to get their ready troops in there. They don't want to, they want to work within the bounds of what's allowed, but they're a real problem for Russia if they decide to get involved. I can't imagine that Russia would want to see Poland jump into this fight because I think they're ready for it.
Yeah, but I can't see a NATO country or NATO countries thinking something like that. So I don't think that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's a political alliance. It's to protect and to defend the territory of the alliance. So I don't see any kind of offensive moves being considered here. So that's just off the table.
Yeah. And I think this is to the benefit of our modern capability of de-escalating. They're also part of the EU. And if they get out of line, they, all of a sudden they find themselves in a similar situation to Russia where, it's like, hey, you can't do that. Here's the financial hit here. Here's, you're kicked out of the EU. All of these things they're trying to be part of. This, I think, allows countries to kind of hold each other accountable. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I do think, this war shows to me that, all of the belligerents will lose. Russia will lose and Ukraine will lose. And that's the sad part, that everybody will be worse off before the war started, and it's still going on. So I think that, what we are coming away again, and this is not the first time, but what we are coming up with this from this war is that, you should really think twice or three times before you start a war, if you think that you're going to get something very big done quickly with little cost. That's a dream. That's not going to happen. So I do think that there will be lessons learned from this war when it's over by many states, and they are looking at really seriously if they even have the kind of the slight understanding that war could be a solution. In most cases, it won't be, even if it looks like one.
That sort of leads me to my next question. I didn't realize I was going to ask this, but you don't go into a land war unless you think you're going to win, especially in the Ukraine right before the big storms hit and everything turns into a mud bog. Who convinces Putin that this is a good idea? I mean, I don't. How does it? I mean, I know you don't know the answer to this, but it just baffles me that they thought that this was a good idea, other than the fact that they thought they would just roll in and shake down Ukraine and take their stuff. I mean, it just amazes me that they thought this was worth it.
Yeah, but this isn't the first time in human history. I think this is kind of a mistake that has been made all over again. And when we are talking about people learning from history, this is the one lesson that they haven't learned. And as I said, for me, looking at contemporary warfare and the effectiveness of even the kind of not so expensive weapon systems that are modern, but they are not so expensive. So it's going to be hard to gain something positive out of a war that you are commencing. So my advice to whatever political decision maker that is thinking that should they kind of decide a quarrel or a competition with the use of large-scale military violence, I would say no, definitely not. Everybody will lose, and the consequences will be there for decades.
I've hit you with a bunch of questions for the last 54 minutes or so, but I want to make sure that I give you a chance to talk about whatever else is interesting to you, because I know, look, you're a scholar on this stuff. What do you want to discuss as we close out?
Well, maybe I just reiterate the point that I think it's really important that coming from a small country in Europe, having a border with a great power, is that for us, and I would say that for quite many European states, I think it's really important that when the days are good and when there are no security threats, I think you shouldn't let your guard down. So I do think that you need to have a long-term capability and ability to invest in defense and other security instruments of the society. That is the kind of the cheapest way to make sure that when the times are bad, that you will cope and it will not end up in disaster. And I do think that's really important, because now we have the bad days. Everybody realizes that we need to do more with defense and other security things. But when the times are good, it's really hard. People start forgetting. So I think that I hope that this is a really bad situation, a terrible situation. But if something good comes out of this, it will produce a kind of a steady long-term stream of security investments that will avoid us getting into these kinds of situations in the future.
I guess we should also mention the fact that there is so much scholarly work on the art of war that's gone on. We've thought through a lot of these problems, which allowed us to maybe prepare for some of this stuff. I mean, it's really incredible. You think about the number of PhDs that are created every year, and over the decades, and all the papers and all the conferences, we spend a lot of time learning and getting smart about war.
Well, I think these academic discussions and even military discussions, they revolve around certain topics, quite often slogans. After the 2014 Crimean annexation, there has been quite a lot written about gray zone warfare or hybrid warfare or the things like that, information warfare. But what we are seeing today is really old-fashioned, brutal attrition warfare.
Right.
And I do think that we haven't been learning maybe all the lessons that there could have been from the case of 2014. So I do think that now we can see that these other aspects of competition that don't involve the use of violence, sure, they are important parts of statecraft. But at the end of the day, when those things don't work, there's always the possibility to turn to this really old-fashioned way, big war thing. And we shouldn't forget that in the future.
I wanted to, there's one more real quick question I want to bring up. And everybody's always wanting to throw Finland into NATO. And you guys haven't done that. Do you see?
No, we haven't.
Oh, you have? Okay.
We haven't. But, this war has changed the discussion totally in Finland. Before the war started, I think that when we did national polls, public opinion polls in Finland, should we join NATO or not, I think that the people saying yes was something like 30%, 30. And now when we're doing the polls, it's something like 60, 65, 55, it's something like that. So the yes votes have doubled in all of these polls. So this means that in the Finnish case, I do think that Russia doesn't want Finland to join NATO. They don't want NATO on their borders, Finnish border, but they have actually achieved a situation where the Finnish general public wants to be part of NATO, or at least the majority of the Finns do.
Yeah, and then if you get Finland, you probably get Sweden too. You guys will move en bloc and be part of NATO, and that just puts that much more pressure. And you're right about not wanting NATO. When you look at a map on NATO is still at some level in the former Yugoslavian states 30 years later, right? They just don't leave because we do a lot of funding with that stuff. And if NATO ends up in Ukraine, that puts a lot of pressure on the Russian border. I mean, that requires just in money and finances just to counter that, to have a presence on the other side of the border. It's not going to ever leave. And so I can understand why Russia wouldn't want NATO to get involved, because that's just something they have to account for in excess of what they already do.
Yeah, but it looks like today the Ukrainian NATO membership it's really far away down the line. So it doesn't seem to be in the cards for some time.
Yeah. Interesting. Any final thoughts? Any final questions? You want to ask me a question?
Well, what are your key takeaways from this war? What have you been surprised by?
I've been surprised at how incapable the forces of Russia were and how reluctant they were to put their equipment into the field, which tells me that their equipment is, look, you and I both know if you drive any kind of military vehicle across someone's farm, if you got 100 of them, some of those vehicles are going to break within a few minutes because it's just incredibly hard on equipment. In video games, you just drive a tank around forever. Nothing ever happens to it. But stuff breaks all the time. And their reluctance to get off the hard roads, that tells me that they have very little confidence in their ability to maintain their equipment and provision it. Otherwise, you would just drives straight through and everything. So that surprised me. And then also the just the overall massive negative and punitive attack on Russia. Now, I'm not justifying Russia's behavior, but getting kicked out of Formula One is like that hits a lot of people at the highest level. If you have a Formula One team and you're a billionaire, you probably weren't expecting that. And it amazes me how the financial thing has spun around. And then how do you rebuild that? So I think about that. And the other thing I think about is I am shocked that this brutal approach to war actually happened. I really thought that we were past that. And hopefully this will be a lesson to all the other major European states that this is not a viable way to go. I guess those are my thoughts.
Okay. Interesting. I think we have several identical views on this.
Yeah. Oh, and drones. I'm fascinated by the drones and all the different ways they're being used.
Well, you are not alone.
Yeah. All right, let me wrap this thing up. Hey, thanks everybody for watching. I appreciate you guys. Here comes the roll. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you